Hi everyone, this is Amy from the Helms Academy, and today we're doing a recap of our Reading and Writing Club from July 28th, 2020, where we talked about reading strategies. So whether you missed our class in person or you're just coming back to review, let's get started. Our first question for today was, what helps you to read more quickly or remember more of what you read? So think about that for yourself. Do you have any strategies that you're already using? And how can you name those and remember to use them, especially when you're taking a test? We're going to talk about 4 strategies today. The first one is skimming and scanning, then self-check, then note-taking and underlining, and finally mental pictures. Our first skill is skimming and scanning. So for skimming, it's about looking over the whole text quickly to gather the important words and phrases. And your goal is to understand the general idea and structure of the text. So with skimming, I would encourage you to use your finger or a pen to follow the text across and move back over and follow it again. This keeps your eyes moving. So you're trying to get an overview of what is in the text, but you don't have to get everything. Just key words, phrases, particularly dates, things that will stand out. So again, your goal is to get a general idea and to know generally what's in the structure. How is it formatted? With scanning, it's a little bit different because scanning is about going back to something that you've maybe already read or at least already skimmed, and you're trying to find key words or phrases or dates or numbers. So you will be looking back for that targeted information rather than being able to understand kind of a general idea of everything. So you might go back and look for a specific year or a specific word or concept, and you train your eyes to look only for that thing. Similar to the game I Spy, if someone tells you, I spy something green, you're going to think about things that are green and train your eyes to only look for green. You won't have to stop and look at every brown thing or gray thing or blue thing or red thing because your eyes know to look for green. So that's the same tool you're going to use, but you're going to do that with words or phrases or numbers. So the text we're going to look at today is about women's basketball. Now, if you were skimming this text, you would take your finger again, and you can practice along with me on your screen, and just trace underneath at about this speed. That will cause your eyes to follow the text quickly. And again, you won't get everything, but your eyes will start to catch the key information and the important words. So that's the skimming aspect of it. Now for scanning, we would need specific questions. So for example, a question might ask, who invented basketball? Well, that gives me 2 clues because who is about a person. So that means I'm looking for a specific person and perhaps a name. And then I'm thinking about, this whole thing is about women's basketball. So we know the word basketball is going to show up a lot, but invented, maybe I'll see the word invented or inventor or creator. All of that will be good words to keep in my brain so I can be on the lookout for those words. Now, I can use my scanning tool similarly to how I use my skimming tool, but rather than looking for all the keywords as I move my finger across, I'm just looking for names and the word invented or created. So this one I can find pretty quickly, right? Just go over the first couple of lines and there, on the second line, invented by Dr. James Naismith. Now, it's always important to just read the whole sentence around it to make sure that's the right information, not just the phrase. But if we look at that whole sentence, we see that is the correct answer. The second question says, when did basketball become the most common women's high school sport? So there we see the word when. So we're looking for a date, maybe a year, maybe a more specific date or an era. So we want to know, when did it become the most common women's high school sport? So with that, I'm also going to pull out high school because that's the more specific part we're talking about within women's basketball. So if I go through my text and move my finger again along the screen so that I can keep my eyes moving. I'm looking for high school, I'm looking for a date, and I'm looking for it becoming the most common or something similar to the most common. Now, if you are doing this at home, you might already be there, but if you go to that last paragraph, that's where I'm going to stop because I see the date, 1940s, and I'm going to check what's around it, and I see high school level, I see most frequently played. That's what I'm looking for. So my answer then is right there at the end in those last two lines, 1940s. So our second strategy today is to do a self-check. It's about asking yourself what you learned. So you could ask yourself, what is this paragraph or passage about in maybe one word or one sentence, whatever might be easiest for you in that moment. This is something that with practice, it gets easier, right? You're able to narrow down, here's a group of information and we want to summarize it into something a little bit more manageable. You might also ask, what was the main point of what the author said in this part? Or you can finish the sentence, this paragraph was about, and think about it in terms of, if you're talking to a friend about it, and they say, hey, what are you reading about? And you want to tell them, but they don't want you to read it back to them. They want you to tell them just generally, what did you learn in this, whatever it is that you're reading? So do your best to summarize it, put it in your own words, because that will also help your memory to retain it. And I encourage you to write down what you learned. If you have a paper and you can write in the margin beside the text, that's great. If you're taking a test online or doing practice online, you will be able to use a scrap piece of paper. And this is especially helpful if you have trouble retaining information. You can write down women's basketball, paragraph 1, and then just a very quick note about what that paragraph was about. That way, when you go back to look for information, when you're answering test questions, or if you're using this for perhaps the writing section of the GED or HiSET or TASC, you might be able to use that guide as a way of saying, I remember there was information in one of these paragraphs about, and you can look at your little guide as to what each paragraph was about that you took notes on. Say, oh, it's got to be in paragraph 3 because that lines up the best. So it saves you some time in the long run because you're going to retain more information in the short term. All right, so here's our women's basketball again. And if we're using these same skills of doing a self-check like we talked about before, we can ask ourselves the questions, what is this paragraph or passage about, or saying this paragraph was about. So let's look at that first paragraph. It says, today basketball is one of the most popular women's sports, both among athletes and fans. Basketball was invented by Dr. James Naismith and introduced to male athletes in 1891. Less than a year later, Sandra Berenson, a physical education instructor at a small women's college, decided the game would be a good alternative to the physical fitness activities offered to young women at the time. So to me, I am thinking, wow, okay, I'm seeing, it's a popular sport. This is when it was invented, and then this is when it was turned into a sport that women could also do. So I might just write beside this, beginning of basketball or origins. And that will help me remember that this is a paragraph that tells me about how it all got started. Now, different people have different responses or different ways they might remember that information. It's okay if you pick a different word or phrase, as long as it helps you encompass what you learned in that area and helps you as a reference tool to get back. There's no one right way to do this. So our third skill for today is note-taking and underlining. So as you read, it's good to take time to underline or to take notes. And again, if you have the paper copy in front of you and you can circle and underline and write on the page, do that. Take advantage of that. But if you aren't able to do that and you need to just use scrap paper, then you can do that too. So I'd encourage you to underline and circle and take notes on dates, definitions, main arguments, the names of important characters if you're reading a story. And if you're reading a story, I'd also encourage you to think about major turning point events. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, any story that's interesting has a lot of changes that happen in it. You never just read a story, well, very rarely, I hope, that just as, this person woke up and then they ate breakfast and then they sat and they ate lunch and then they went to bed. It's just not interesting. So, maybe they ate breakfast and there was a knock on their door, right? That's the change in the story. This person appears, they want to go on a trip, and then the trip has all of these ups and downs and turns. So that's what I would encourage you to pay attention to if you're reading a story, is what are the major events happening? You can mark those down on your notes too. One suggestion for note-taking is to make sure that you keep everything short. So if you can think of abbreviations or shorter ways to take notes that you'll still remember and understand later, that's your best bet. Now, you can also feel free to circle things that you don't know or understand or mark them down on your paper, like confusing vocabulary or your difficult or confusing statements from a text. I'd encourage you, though, if you see a question about one of those things and you're unsure, go ahead and answer the question, and then you can mark it as something you want to come back to later. The reason you want to do that is because you don't want to leave anything blank. At least if you answer it with something, pick your favorite letter, doesn't matter, then you'll at least have a chance of getting it right in case you run out of time at the end or forget to come back to it. But you don't want to spend too much time getting stuck on something, and you don't want to get to the end of the test and run out of time with some of your questions blank. So always make sure you fill in something and just mark on your scrap paper that you want to come back to that. So if I were looking at this text, and for example, maybe I would look at the third paragraph, which says, as women's basketball spread, the sport faced some opposition, including the criticism that too much physical exertion could be harmful to young women. Nonetheless, women's teams formed in high schools, colleges, businesses, recreation centers, and neighborhoods across the United States. By the 1940s, basketball had become the women's sport most frequently played at the high school level. So with that information, some things that I might underline or take notes on is that the first sentence, we see opposition and criticism, right? So it had some pushback on basketball. And then we see that it didn't matter. The teams still formed all over a community. Now, you could say a couple of quick notes about high schools. For example, you could shorten that to HS and write down some of those things, or you could generalize it and say, became popular in many community organizations. Up to you how you would like to handle something like that. And then that last sentence, I might write 1940s most frequently played HS sport. Something quick that will help me remember that it was really popular and very frequently played in the 1940s. Our last skill for today is making mental pictures. So I want you to try to imagine what is being said in your mind's eye and create a mental picture so that you will both retain the information a little better because you'll have that visual as well as the text that you're reading. So you're getting that in kind of two ways now. And it also just makes it more interesting to read and more memorable because of that. So if we look at the second paragraph here, it says the rules Berenson established for her female players differed from men's rules. The rectangular playing floor was divided into 3 equal zones. So this is a good one to imagine because when I think basketball, I think what I'm used to today in basketball. Now, we currently have 2 equal zones, and this one had 3. So right away, I'm changing my mental picture of what a basketball court looks like. Now it has 3 equal zones in it. Each team had 9 players. Well, today we have 5. So now I got to think about having more people, right? Instead of 10 people out on a court, now we have 18 people on this court. And it tells us what they play. And then it says a player was restricted to her own zone on the court. So just imagine we have all these people out on the court, but they can only go in certain areas. It also says they can only hold the ball for 3 seconds, can only dribble 3 times before passing. They can't steal. So you can start to picture what this game might look like by creating that mental image. And that, again, will help you to better remember and use the information that you're learning because you're applying it to something that you can imagine and create. So thank you so much for joining me for this Reading and Writing Club recap. I hope that you learned something new and that you'll join us in person one of these weeks for our classes if you're a Helms Academy student. Now, below you'll see that we have a Facebook and an Instagram, and you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel so you get all the latest updates. And finally, you can check us out at helmsacademy.org.